Hey, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to part 3 of NestJS tutorial. There's going to be some slide backtracking before we jump into part 3. I've discovered a package called Typegoose that is going to allow us to write Mongoose schema with classes. I'm going to utilize this package for our project. So let's go ahead and install Typegoose. We will also install the packages that we need for this video, which are JSON Web Token, Passport, JWT, bcrypt.bcrypt.js, and NestJS Passport. We will also need the type definitions for the above packages except for the NestJS one. So let's install those with the flag -d so they install into your dev dependencies. So now we will start with our base model. Change the interface to class and document to Typegoose. Import Typegoose and prop from Typegoose. Prop is a decorator from Typegoose. Prop takes in an object as an argument. The object looks exactly like the options object when you define your schema using Mongoose. And I'm going to default these days to now. I also add an ID field string. Next, go to your base service, document to Typegoose, and model of T to model type of T. And all the T's in here will become instance type of T. Instance type and model type come from Typegoose package. So instance type of T has a toJSON function that will return T. So let's keep that in mind. Let's also add a clear collection function. This function will help us to quickly clear database for a specific collection when we develop. On deployment or production, I suggest taking this off or implement some sort of checking. Next, we're gonna need some directories. So let's just make directory a filters directory in shared, a utilities directory in shared. We're gonna need a file in shared called API exception.model.ts, and a file in filters called HttpException.filter.ts, and two files in utilities. One is enum2array.ts and another one is getOperationID.ts. We start with API exception model. So this is the class model for our HTTP exception error that we throw from our services and our controllers. So we extend the default error to this API exception class to have a more comprehensive error response to the client. We are going to decorate these properties with API model property optional, so they will be made available to Swagger. Next, we go to HttpExceptionFilter. This is a class. Implements exception filter. Exception filter ensures that this class will have a catch method which takes in an error and a host of type argument host. We're going to get the context from the host and the request and response from the context. So the context is what controller is being invoked, and request and response is basically the express request and response object when you invoke a route handler in Express. Next, we're going to handle the unauthorized error. and I'm gonna check for the error response if its type is not string. Then I'm gonna assign the message to the response. You can say whatever you want here. I just say you do not have permission to access this resource. Then we're going to return the JSON, an error JSON with all the properties that we define in the API exception. So in NestJS, you have a thorough HTTP exception, and the first argument is the error that is going to be passed in this catch method. So you have access to that. So the errors here, the errors array or object is going to be the errors from Mongo error, but specifically from Mongo error. Next we go to enum array, and it's going to be a function. It takes in an enum and it returns the string array. So we're just going to iterate through the keys of the enum and map back the value of the enum. Next we go to get operation ID. This is also a function. Enum to array and get operation ID are so-called helpers. Get operation ID takes in a model name, and the operation name. I also have a like a helper function to title case in here to transform the string to a title case and get rid of all the transform it to a title case with the first letter capitalized. So if you pass in like a two-word string, it's gonna get rid of the spaces as well. Now we're gonna define a model, and we want to transform that to a title case, and we get rid of the spaces, white spaces. Same thing for the operation. Finally, I return a title, an empty title, and the operation ID, which is the model underscore the operation. This is for Swagger later. Made a mistake. Next, go to your default.ts in your config. We add a JWT key. You can pass whatever you want. This is the secret key for your JSON Web Token. Now go to your configuration enum and also add that key and value, JWT key. Now we are going to generate the user module, a controller, a user controller, a user service, an auth service in shared, and a JWT strategy service in auth. So the idea here is you can implement different strategies that way. We're going to need some directories as well. So in user, make a directory models, and inside of models, make a directory view models. And we're going to create a file called UserRole.Enum.ts in models, and user.model.ts also inside of models. And in view models, we're going to need a user vm.model.ts, login vm.model.ts, a login response -vm.model.ts, and finally a register vm.model.ts. So VM is view model, by the way. And in auth, we're going to need a JWT payload.ts. So we're going to start with our enum, UserRole.Enum. So export enum, UserRole. It's going to be admin, and user. So we're going to have two rows here. Next, let's go to UserModule. It's going to be a class. User extends from base model. It's going to have username, password, role, optional first name, optional last name, and we're going to decorate these with props so it can be added to the schema. So username is required, and the message will be username is required, min length is 6. Also a message, and username is unique. The same thing for password, but without a unique. And UserRole has an enum, UserRole, and first name and last name is just prop. And we're gonna have a getters for a full name. Full name is a virtual. It will not be saved in the database, but we compute it. And also decorate with prop. Next, we're going to need a static getter model that will return model type of user, and it's a new user get model for class. We're passing user and some options, the schema options that we define in the base model class. Next, we need a model name getter, and it returns a string. It just return this.model name. So it will return user as a string. Next, we go into our user VM model.ts. It's going to be a class. User VM extends from base model VM. Is basically has everything that user has, but without a password. We don't expose the password to the client side, so that's why we omit the password from the user VM, and we're going to use AutoMapper to do that. And decorate these with API model property and API model property optional. And for the enum, this is where our enum helper comes into play. So enum to array and pass in user role. So that we return an array of admin user. Next, go to your login VM, and it's going to be a username string and password string, and decorate it. So everything that you want Swagger to notify Swagger that is available, make sure you decorate it with API model property. Next, register VM. This is going to extend from login VM, and it has two additional optional fields, first name and last name. So login, you need username and password, but to register, you need username, password, and optional first name and last name. So that's what it is. And finally, let's go to your login response VM. It's going to have a token of type string and the user of user VM. So the token is the JWT token on login successfully. Next, in your service, let's extend base service of type user, and let's have our constructor and call the super constructor. We're going to inject the model From inject model is from NestJS Mongoose. It takes in a string. It is usually the model name, and we set it to user model of type model type user. And we also need the mapper service. Then we're going to assign this dot model to the user model and this dot mapper to mapper service dot mapper. So now if you try this dot, you will see we have access to all the functions in base service with the correct type for user. Next, let's go to user module, and we're gonna export the user service so we can use user service in different places. Now we import the Mongoose module and call the for feature. This is to register the models for our Mongoose, and it's gonna be an array of a name and schema. So name is user model name, schema user model dot schema. This is why we have the static model and model name. Now next we go to share module. We're going to import the user module so we can have access to the user service, and we're going to export the auth service as well. Next, let's go to auth service. Let's go to JWT payload. It's going to be an interface of username string, role, user role, and IAT, which is issued at of type date. Let's go to auth service. We're going to need a private read-only JWT options of type sign options and the JWT key of type string, and let's call our constructor. So we inject the user service using forward ref. So this is because user service and auth service is a circular dependency. They depend on each other. Usually you want to avoid doing that, but for our case, this is the only circular dependencies we have, so we're all right. We also need the configuration service. So the JWT options exactly like the JSON Web Token options. At the list, you should have an expiration. I set it to 12 hours. And JWT, we get it from the configuration service. We're going to have a side payload method in the auth service that takes in the JWT payload. It's going to return a string. We also have a validate payload that takes in the payload as well, and it's going to return the promise of instance type of user. And it just inside payload just return the side method from JSON Web Token. We pass in the payload, the key, and the options. And in validate, we're going to return the file1 on user service, and we pass in the username. Next, let's go to our strategy. Let's call a constructor and inject the auth service. We also need the configuration service. And we need to extend the JWT strategy, extend the Passport strategy from NestJS Passport. And we're going to pass in the strategy from Passport JWT package. We need to call it super and support it with an object that has JWT from request. It's going to be from auth header with bearer as bearer token. So it's going to be bearer authorization bearer and then your JWT token in the request header. and secret key is from configuration service. We're going to have a validate function in here that takes in the payload, JWT payload, and a done callback. This doesn't return anything. We're going to return the callback here. So we're going to try to get the user from the payload. If there's no user, we're going to return done and pass in the an unauthorized HTTP exception as the first argument for our error, and then false for the user. If there is user, then we return no for the error and user for the user, and payload.issueAdd for the info. So the flow here is we get the payload from the token from the auth header, and we try to get the user, and then it will append to request.user the user if it's successful. Next, go to your mapper service, and we're gonna create a map from user to user VM, and we're gonna for source ID underscore ID because we're gonna get the ID, not the underscore one. So ignore it, and we're gonna do the same thing for the password. This is where password will be submitted from user to user VM. Theoretically, user VM still have access to password, but on the client side you don't have that access. And then let's go to your user service and start implementing the register and the login. So the register will take in the register VM, and it's gonna return user. So let's deconstruct the register VM to get a username and password, first name and last name. Let's declare a new user equals new this.model. So this will return an instance type of user. Now we're going to assign the username to the username, first name to the first name, last name to the last name. For the password, we're going to use bcrypt.js, and we're going to just implement some simple chain sort and hash. I'm going to pass in the password and the sort. Now we're going to try catch this block because there might be something wrong with the operation on Mongoose, so we want to try catch it. The error here is we return as a Mongo error, so we pass the whole thing to the HTTP exception, and the status is internal server error. We try to this.create new user, and it's going to return result.toJSON. As I said, toJSON returns the user object. Now login will take in login VM, and it's going to return the login response VM. We're going to deconstruct the VM as well to get the username and password. We're going to try to get the user associated with the username passed in. If no user found, then we're going to throw an exception. Say invalid credentials. This is like wrong username, and the status is bad request. Next, we're gonna try to see if the password matches. We're gonna use the compare method of bcrypt. If it's not matched, then we're gonna do the same thing. We'll throw a new exception, invalid credentials. This is like wrong password, and the bad request status. If everything's okay, we're gonna declare our payload. We're gonna pass in the username from user and the role from user, and we get a token. So the reason why we only have username and role in the payload, because we're going to need the role for our to-dos later, and we don't want to put like more information that we need to in the payload in the JWT token. And here I forgot to inject the auth service, so I'm doing it now. As is mentioned earlier, this is circular dependency, so we need to use forward ref. Now we're going to use the side payload to return our token. Then finally we're going to get the user VM, and we map it using the user to JSON. That user is the instance type user, so that's why we use to JSON. And we return our result, token and user. That's user service. Now let's go to user controller. First thing, I want to change user to users, and we add the decorator API use tags, and we use the module name. Let's add a constructor and inject the user service. We're gonna have a register and login in our controller. The register is gonna take in the register VM. It's going to return a promise of user VM. Let's decorate our register with a post decorator with a path of register, and we're going to decorate. We're going to notify Swagger the response type of this method. First is going to be an OK, a success one created, and the type is user VM. Next is the bad request one, and the type is the API exception one. Next, we want to notify Swagger of the operation of this. That's when we use the get operation ID helper. We pass in the module name for the first one and register for the second argument. We also decorate the register VM with the body decorator. This is like request.body when you use Express. Now we're gonna deconstruct register VM to get a username and password. And we're gonna check for these. If they are known, then we throw the exception. Same thing for password. Now we're gonna try to find any existing users associated with the username, and any operation that has to do with Mongoose, we should put them in a try catch block. And we use the file one from user service and pass in the username. If there is an existing user, we're gonna throw an exception saying this username is assisted. It's gonna be a bad request. If everything's alright, we're gonna get the new user from the register method in the user service. It takes in the VM. And finally, we return the mapping from user to user VM. So that's our register. Now let's move on to login. Login takes in logins is decorated the same as register with different path, different return type. It's login response VM and different operation. And it's login VM, also decorated with a body decorator. and return a promise of login response VM. So because login VM also only has two fields, username and password, and they both required, so I'm gonna get the fields, which is the keys of login VM. I'm gonna iterate over these keys, and if they are null, then I just throw an exception, a bad request exception. Finally, we just return the login method from user service and pass in the login VM. Next, we're going to go to man.ts and we're going to register our HttpExceptionFilter as a global filter. And then we're done. So I made a mistake. I forgot to set the default of the enum to a user or admin. So I tested and it returns no, so the JWT token was wrong. So let's add default to your enum in UserModule.ts. Now here's I demo the Swagger after the register and login has been added. You can see password is not found in the user VM. It has been ignored. Now I try login and it returns me the token. And let's use that token and go to JWT.io. You see the payload. So thank you for watching. In the next video, we're going to start our to-dos, CRUD operations on our to-dos. So let's see you in the next video. Bye bye. Xong rồi.